Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here with us today. In this explainer, we are embarking on a really fascinating deep dive into a topic that honestly touches almost every single human life. We're talking about the struggle with personal failings, trauma, and suffering. We're going to bridge the gap between ancient spiritual texts and modern trauma psychology to see exactly how these age-old frameworks address our deepest, most contemporary wounds. Now, I gotta ask you a question that feels, well, completely counterintuitive. How can human weakness actually be our greatest strength? I mean, we live in a world that constantly tells us to hide our flaws, optimize our lives, and project nothing but strength, right? But the sources we're looking at today suggest the exact opposite. They propose that the things we consider our greatest liabilities might actually be the very keys that unlock our deepest healing and resilience. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the paradox of weakness, then Paul's thorn in the flesh, healing relational wounds, biblical models of betrayal, and we'll wrap it all up with the sufficiency of grace.
Starting us off with Section 1, the paradox of weakness.
Look, we all deal with suffering. We all experience betrayal, and if we're being completely honest with ourselves, we all have those habitual flaws or struggles that we just can't seem to shake. The question isn't really if we're going to experience these things, but rather, what do we actually do with them when they happen? To answer that, our sources point us to an ancient anchor text, specifically 2 Corinthians 12:9. It reads, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Now, this isn't just some nice poetic phrase you put on a bumper sticker. Our theological sources frame this as the ultimate, counterintuitive solution to our universal struggles. The text suggests that divine power doesn't show up when we're at our absolute best, but precisely when we are at our most vulnerable. To really understand how this was historically interpreted, we can look at the 18th century biblical commentator Matthew Henry. He called this the Christian paradox. Henry argued that when we see ourselves as weak, we actually stop relying on our own power and instead go out of ourselves to receive strength from a higher source. And his takeaway is super challenging. He says we shouldn't actually run from our afflictions. Instead, we should view them as the exact opportunities where divine grace can manifest itself the most clearly. Moving right along to Section 2, Paul's thorn in the flesh. So, St. Paul was an absolute powerhouse of the early Christian church. According to the texts, he had mystical experiences so profound he was literally lifted to the third heaven. But despite these incredible spiritual heights, he wrote that he suffered from a humiliating thorn in the flesh that tormented him and that God actually refused to take away. Now, traditionally, this is viewed as a physical ailment, maybe bad eyesight or some kind of illness. But what's really interesting here is a fascinating alternative perspective brought forward in a Catholic Answers podcast by Father Hugh Barber. He suggests this thorn might have actually been a humiliating moral failing or habitual temptation, something Paul just couldn't overcome on his own. Which begs the question, why on earth would God allow such a revered figure to struggle with a moral failing? Well, drawing on the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, the explanation is that God acts as a physician of souls. Think of it this way. Sometimes a physician commits a lesser weakness, like a humiliating habitual struggle, to cure a much graver, way more dangerous disease, which in this case is pride. If Paul was perfectly righteous all on his own, he might have become completely arrogant. So this lingering weakness forced him into a posture of humility and total reliance on grace. Which brings us to Section 3, healing relational wounds. Now, this ancient idea of finding strength and transformation through our deepest wounds, it isn't just an abstract theological concept. It's actually being directly applied by the modern church to trauma care today. We're pulling here from a fascinating paper published in the International Journal of Education, Information Technology, and others. The authors explore trauma-informed pastoral care, and they operate on the premise that relational injuries, things like betrayal, loss, or abuse, they don't just hurt us psychologically, they fundamentally disrupt our spiritual equilibrium. They erode our trust in ourselves, in others, and in the divine. So healing these wounds requires a highly specialized, trauma-informed strategy. The academic paper outlines 4 practical steps for this kind of pastoral trauma recovery. First up, getting to know the individual by listening deeply, without rushing in to offer quick solutions. Second, reclaiming the body, utilizing grounding techniques, because trauma often physically disconnects us. Third, retelling the story, helping individuals reframe their painful experiences within a much larger narrative of faith. And fourth, helping to live in the moment through small, realistic steps. The big takeaway here, Recovery is an ongoing, complex journey. It is definitely not a swift, forced mandate to just get over it. And that transitions us perfectly into Section 4, Biblical Models of Betrayal. And this brilliantly illustrates how these modern clinical steps are actually modeled perfectly throughout ancient biblical history. Look at Ruth and Naomi dealing with massive collective trauma and loss, yet finding blessings through radical loyalty. We see Joseph experiencing severe sibling betrayal. His forgiveness brings family reconciliation, but the text definitely acknowledged the wound was real. Then there's Peter, experiencing the crushing guilt of denying his closest friend, which required restorative dialogue. What all these figures share is that they found spiritual recovery by prioritizing their faithfulness to God, even when their human relationships were deeply, deeply fractured. So, the crucial point is this, straight from our academic source. True renewal completely surpasses simple interpersonal mending. This is a massive takeaway. Forgiveness does not always mean full relational reconciliation. Sometimes a relationship cannot, or honestly should not, be put back together exactly as it was. A relational scar may remain as a reminder of the experience, and that is perfectly okay. The ultimate priority is spiritual safety and transformation, not some forced artificial fix.
Wrapping things up with our final section, the sufficiency of grace.
Okay, so if our relational wounds aren't perfectly repaired and if our personal thorns in the flesh aren't taken away, what does it actually mean to rely on grace? How does that work in our everyday lives? Well, let's look at the language itself. In the original Greek text, where Paul is told, "My grace is sufficient," the word used for sufficient is archeo. It translates to being possessed of unfailing strength. I absolutely love the humorous observation from commentator Alan Redpath that our sources highlighted here. He points out how funny it is to think of God's infinite grace being merely sufficient for a little old us. He says it's literally like a tiny fish swimming in the vast ocean, terrified that it might drink the ocean dry. The grace available is comically, overwhelmingly more than enough.
Author Donna Butcher breaks this down into 3 powerful practical takeaways. First, she says this isn't just generic goodwill. It is the victorious, unconditional grace of a higher power. Second, it's available right now, not somewhere in the future when you've supposedly fixed yourself, but right now in this exact messy moment. And third, it is available for you specifically. No one rests outside of this formidable love. Your specific thorn, your specific trauma is absolutely not beyond its reach. Let's move to and see how this builds, because when you truly grasp the magnitude of this unearned favor, the fact that you literally don't have to be perfect, and that your weaknesses are actually the canvas for this grace, the natural response is just overwhelming gratitude. Our sources emphasize that true serenity in suffering is ultimately found by practicing gratitude for this exact grace. It completely changes the lens through which you view your entire life and your struggles. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought today. We spend so much time and energy begging for our problems, our flaws, and our relational scars to just be completely erased. But based on everything we've looked at today, instead of asking for your thorn to be removed, how might it become your greatest source of strength? How might your specific weakness be the exact place where you learn compassion, humility, and reliance on something way greater than yourself? Think on that. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer today. Keep learning, keep exploring, and I will see you next time.